Okay, so thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. I admit I don't know very much about oceans, so I did kind of scam my way into the seminar series. But I hope that you kind of appreciate learning a little bit about what's happening at that sort of interface between the ocean and the terrestrial systems, which is where I tend to focus most of my work. And so with that, I'll talk to you a little bit today, kind of a broad talk, thinking a bit more about just what do we know about coastal wetland ecology? What are ways that we need to learn a little bit more, and how can we apply that knowledge to thinking about best practices for conserving and restoring these ecosystems? And I'll also say that I would love to talk to you about the community work that I do, but I didn't put that into this talk. So they said I had 35 minutes. So I'm going to talk to you mostly about the science and the ecology today, but happy to chat more about the rest afterwards. Also, if I'm not speaking loud enough, just like let me know, like put your hands up or do something weird just so that I can do better at projecting. Okay, so to get started, I like to begin all of my talks with kind of a convincing argument for why you should care about what I'm about to talk to you about in the talk overall. And so the question here is, why should you care about wetlands? Why should anyone care about these kinds of ecosystems? And the way that I tend to like to capture why people care about things are placing them into these two different groups, where one is like, what does this thing do for me? And so on the one hand, we've got a non-exhaustive list of many of the different ecosystem, hydrological, economic, cultural services and functions provided by coastal wetland systems. And so if you're someone who feels really strongly about services rendered, these are some of the things that we get from these coastal systems that are really valuable, that are really important, and that you would notice were missing from your life if we didn't have any more wetlands on the planet. So that's one argument. Another really big argument for why people care about stuff is money. And I think that we all are pretty aware of how much that drives decisions that are made across the globe. So in terms of the sort of financial implications, a paper came out way back in like, 97, I think originally, where an author and some colleagues decided to try to put a dollar value to the economic services, or really the things that you are provided by different natural systems, and how can we put a dollar value to those things and really try to understand concretely what are the different things that we're getting from these systems from a financial perspective. And so they went out, did all this work, did some numbers, math, and these values were then updated again in 2022. And so we know that global wetlands provide functions and services that are valued at roughly $47 trillion a year. And so this basically means that if we were to remove every single wetland on the planet, it would cost humans $47 trillion every single year to provide ourselves with the exact same services and functions that wetlands provide just by existing. So if you're someone who cares about money, this might be a reason to also be invested in making sure that these are really healthy systems. Okay, and so that's like my one pitch for why you should care, and I'm just going to move on to the rest at this point. And so thinking broadly, wetlands are really tricky to define. They are found everywhere across the globe. They consist of a variety of different kinds of habitat types. And so I've just listed a few here. So we've got bogs, fens, swamps, different kinds of marsh systems. So they're very, very diverse. The ecological complexities are really quite high across these different kinds of spaces. And so if you say you work in a wetland, it doesn't really narrow it down to very much. You could say that to someone's face and they'd be like, that could mean anything. And so what I like to do is I try to narrow this down a little bit by focusing specifically on coastal systems. And so when I talk about coastal wetlands, I'm really thinking about three broad categories. And so these are marshes, so either salt marshes or freshwater marshes, and these are found in largely temperate regions across the globe. We've got mangrove forests, and so these are found in largely tropical regions across the globe, and then also seagrass beds, which are largely also found in tropical regions. And so collectively, these ecosystems make up less than 1% of the global sort of surface area, but provide functions and services that are wildly disproportionate to their size. So given how small they are, they do a ton for us. And so the absence of these systems is really quite notable across the spaces where they exist. Okay, I know I'm going fast, but they said 35 minutes, so I'm trying to fit it a lot. And so what I want to do now is really kind of transition into sharing a bit about what we have historically known about how these systems have functioned from an ecological perspective, what we're kind of missing in terms of our understanding, and where we can try to fill in some of those gaps. And so to do that, I want to start with just a very brief history. So I'll just run through a timeline of our sort of historical ecological understanding of coastal systems, and then fill you in with where we are today and where things are hopefully moving into the future. So when I said I was going to give a timeline, I was very literal. I've made a timeline. So early research within coastal systems started in roughly the 1950s, and this work tended to focus primarily within the US, so sort of the southeast and the northeastern part of the United States. And a lot of these early studies were really interested in trying to figure out how is energy being moved into and out of these systems? What is the flux of energy? What's controlling those processes across these systems? And in that work, what they basically decided was that primarily across coastal systems, the tides are really the sort of large factor that contributes to what we're seeing happen in terms of the level of functioning and the maintenance of different features across the system. So these physical abiotic components are really what's most important across these systems, and the biological components, or the species that are present within them, are less relevant in terms of the level of function that you see across these spaces. And so this was really that first sort of early ecological paradigm defining wetland systems across the coastal system. And so from there, additional studies came out in the 90s and into the early 2000s, where we're really starting to question those early conclusions that the tides are really the only thing that matters and nothing else is really all that important across these spaces, where researchers are now going out into these environments where they're seeing that the loss of certain species across these ecosystems has led to these really dramatic cascading effects across the whole ecosystem overall in terms of the level of function, in terms of species diversity, specifically thinking about the role of herbivores across these spaces. So their ability to overconsume vegetation has had dramatic impacts on the level of function across these environments. And so that has indicated that these are species that actually do something really important. So it's not just the tides that matter, but different kinds of species across these spaces also do a lot in shaping the health and function of these environments. Okay, moving further into time and sort of where we kind of are now with the research happening across coastal systems is we're better at recognizing that it's not only the physical, the abiotic parts that influence the way that these systems function, but also these really top-down biological biotic interactions are also really important. So there's a lot of ongoing research now really trying to understand which one of these different components, which one of these sort of top-down versus bottom-up approaches are really driving the level of function that we see across these spaces. And there's not a huge consensus here yet. So there's a lot of really interesting work that points in one direction depending on where you are and a different direction depending on where you are. So there's a lot of complexity across these spaces. And one thing that I find is often missing from these conversations is really thinking about the role that species interactions might play within these dynamics. Often the research that you look at focuses on like one trophic level. So they'll be like herbivores. What are herbivores doing within these spaces? Or detritivores. What are detritivores doing across these spaces? And kind of ignores the fact that species don't exist alone, that they really do exist within these connections with other species within the systems. And trying to understand how those dynamics also then influence how the whole system functions is really new and something that we're really just starting to wrap our heads around. And that's where I kind of try to fit myself. So those are the kind of the questions that I'm really interested in, is thinking about the ecological complexity of these systems and how does that then influence how the system functions overall. And as sort of a bit of proof to tell you that like we're not great at doing research that really focuses on the whole picture, this is a graph that came out several years ago, but the trends are still quite consistent. And thinking about how many papers have been published along coastal ecosystems that are focusing on bottom-up features, so those physical abiotic components of the system, how many have been published looking at top-down features, so thinking about the biological interactions, the different species that are present across those spaces, and then how many papers have been published that look at both together. And so if you're looking at, I know the color scheme here was chosen, wasn't great for the purposes of this talk, but overall, so the black bar indicates that most studies are really focusing on the bottom-up. So we're still seeing a really large emphasis on people going out doing research focusing on the physical and abiotic parts of the system, and far fewer studies that are looking at either top down, so the white bar, which is like here, and then even fewer that are looking at both of them together. So we're seeing a huge sort of skew and a bias in our knowledge in terms of what we know about these systems, because we're still kind of basing the work we do on those early studies that told us the physical parts matter the most. And so people have just kind of continued to run with that without really taking into account the rest of the features that are also really important, but we just know a lot less about. Okay, so what does this all mean and how do I fit into it? So what I like to do in terms of the work that I try to fit myself into is I don't often articulate myself as like a pioneer at the leading edge of like figuring out new stuff. I actually prefer to look at like, what do we know and what like doesn't make sense inside of what we already know, and how do we fill in some of those gaps? And so because it's pretty obvious that we don't have a lot of information about these sort of top-down biological components, that's where I'm most interested in trying to fill in some of those gaps and try to understand those elements a bit more. And so to do that, so this work is a couple years old at this point, but still really relevant. So I set up a bunch of experiments across Connecticut. So Connecticut's in the United States on the East Coast. Think about where Massachusetts and New York State are. It's sort of in that area. And so I set up field experiments within these regions to try to manipulate the presence or absence of certain species, and then measure and see what happens to the ecosystems that they're found in. And so the point here is really to get directly at whether or not these interactions between species play a role across these different kinds of environments. So in those ecosystems, so I worked in New England salt marshes, and so these are the species that I focused on for this work. So the vegetation here is smooth cordgrass, and so this is the sort of dominant salt marsh vegetation that you find across the East Coast. Up here is the purple marsh crab, and so this is a burrowing herbivore, so a pretty important player within these landscapes. Shown here is a fiddler crab. So this is another burrowing crab, but it's a detritivore, so it consumes organic matter in the soil. And then lastly here, a friend, well, not a friend, but sort of a really familiar face, I would say, along, or becoming familiar along this coastline. So this is European green crab. I have feelings about this species, which we can talk about, but this was the species that I focused on here in terms of its role as a potential predator across these spaces. And so this was really the sort of specific system that I focused on for this work. And so to do manipulation experiments, it's really as simple as it sounds. It's like labor intensive, but at least theoretically, it's pretty straightforward, where you go out, you build a bunch of cages, you set them up across the entire landscape within the intertidal zone. And then you establish different treatments for each of these different cages. And so for this particular experiment, these were the different treatments that I had set up. And so the first one here are just the basic controls. So I didn't manipulate anything across these different spaces. These are just me trying to understand, how does this site function in the absence of any kind of manipulation? Just like it's doing its own thing, how does it function? What does it look like? And then I had 2 manipulation experiments, where the first one was a predator exclusion cage. So the fiddler crab and the purple marsh crab could move freely in and out of these cages, but the predator was like fully excluded because it can't burrow, it can't climb into the cages, so it can't have access to those particular plots. And so this is really focusing on just that one particular trophic level of their potential prey. And then the other treatment here is the predator inclusion. So again, the fiddler crab and purple marsh crab can move freely in and out of the cages as they see fit, but I have now fully confined the predator within the cage. And so it can't get out, it's just sort of stuck doing its thing in there until I say it can't, until I'm done with it. And so the idea with this is that I'm really trying to understand not only the different impacts that individual species might have along the landscape, but also now trying to understand how the interactions between these different trophic levels might also influence the level of function. And so to do that, you take a ton of different measurements. And so just shown here are the ones that I took for this particular experiment. And these were chosen because they're just some of the most commonly measured properties for coastal wetland systems. So when people are trying to go out and see, like, how is this system functioning, what's happening across this landscape, these are some of the features that are measured. And so I wanted to be consistent across prior studies. And so that's why those metrics were chosen for this work. Okay, so the next slide is going to be a really big data slide. And so I like to preface by saying that there's a lot of information. You don't have to take it all in. I'll try to walk you through bit by bit just to kind of highlight what I think are the most important takeaways. And so you don't kind of get stuck in the weeds, which I feel like can happen a lot in talks like this. I'm also going to take a drink of water because I'm like, so many words are coming out of my mouth. Okay, so in terms of results for this particular study, so what I'll do is I'll just kind of uncover bits and pieces of it at a time. And so just in terms of orienting you to what you're seeing here, I worked at 3 different field sites. So those are listed across the top. Across the bottom are the different treatments at each site. So we've got that control, the no predator treatment, and then the predator included treatment. And then along the y-axis here, I'll start uncovering different variables that I was looking at. So across the first one, looking specifically at organic matter content in the soil. And all I'm going to do is highlight sites where I saw significant differences between the treatments. So I'm not going to get into the details of what those differences were, but just highlighting that differences existed, and that in itself matters for the purposes of this particular study. So first, when looking at soil organic matter content, the button's not working. There we go. I saw significant differences at 2 of the 3 sites. And so we saw that the treatments that I had established impacted organic matter content at 2 of the sites, but not at all of them. And so that's all I'll say for now about that. And so then looking at another variable, so right now we're looking at nitrogen content in the soil. For this one, I saw significant differences among the treatments at all 3 sites. And then for the last variable that I'll show, which is biomass, so above ground vegetation, I saw, again, significant differences at 2 of the 3 sites. And so as you can see, looking at this, it's like a mess, right? It's just like nothing here makes a ton of sense, which is sort of my relationship with ecology overall. But generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that, one, we're seeing significant differences due to treatments, right? We're seeing predator-prey interactions or species presence or absence is impacting certain functions. What we're also noting is that the sort of impacts that they're having are different depending on where you are. And so there's a lot of context dependency going on here, where each site, you're seeing certain changes, but each site isn't showing the exact same changes across time. And that is important to note. So recognizing that these are not going to be easily generalizable trends that we'll find across a variety of different spaces, but that there's likely to be a lot of different variables and contexts within each site that influence some of these outcomes. And that, I think, is a really important ecological endeavor to try to figure that out a bit more. And so I forgot I had this slide here, but this is the takeaway slide of everything I just said. So predator sort of presence or absence matters, but that these impacts are context dependent. So a change you see at one site is not necessarily going to be the exact same change that you see at another site. So the question that I find additionally interesting to really add into this is, how do we then apply that knowledge to the ways in which we manage or think about managing landscapes? I'm someone who, as much as I enjoy ecological endeavors and doing research, I think it's really important to find ways to make sure it is useful in practice. And so the next thing that comes to mind for me is, what are the ways that this information might help us do a better job of conserving or restoring these ecosystems? And so I didn't mention this at the top of the talk, but coastal systems and wetlands in particular are among the most threatened ecosystems globally. So we've lost roughly 50% of most of the known wetlands since the 18th century. And there are a variety of different reasons for this, but humans are obviously the largest sort of bad guy in this story. And there are 3 generally like large things that we do across these spaces that lead to these losses. And so the first one is just really simple land conversion. So we take a wetland and we turn it into something else. And usually it's aquaculture. That's like a really big reason for wetland conversion, especially in Southeast Asia, is taking something that was a wetland and turning it into like a shrimp pond, for example. So that's a really big reason for the losses. Another is climate change and sea level rise. And so unlike a lot of other kinds of systems, coastal wetlands are usually pretty good at moderating the sort of height of their platform relative to sea level rise changes. They have this process called accretion, where they can really take on organic matter to help them become either larger or smaller, depending on what's happening with the sort of sea level changes, but they can't keep up with the rate at which sea level rise is occurring now. So these are coastal systems that are actually effectively drowning as sort of we see this increase in sea level rise through time. And so that's another really big problem. And then the last one, which is a bit more consistent with what we're talking about today, is the loss of species from these systems has led to these cascading effects that can ultimately lead to the loss of the entire ecosystem, which sounds really dramatic, but is also like a real thing that can happen. And so oftentimes what we're seeing is, because we're recognizing the value of these ecosystems, both economically and also in terms of the sort of services and functions that they provide, restoration is becoming a really, really big topic for these ecosystems. And so the goal is to usually take something that looks like this. And so this is a degraded, overconsumed salt marsh system, do a little bit of science and magic and maybe prayer, and then hopefully turn it into something that looks a bit more like this, right? So we've got, at least visually, a healthy, functioning coastal system. And so even though we put a lot of work and effort into restoration, it turns out we're not great at it, which is unfortunate. And so I'll show you what I mean. There are 2 kind of ways that we can think about evaluating the success of a restoration project. One is, did we do a good job of recovering certain levels of health compared to its degraded and damaged state? So that's like one metric of success. Did we improve from where it started from in our effort to do a good job of making the system healthy? The other way that we can also measure success of these efforts is really thinking about, does this restored site function and perform the same way as like a healthy site would normally function and perform? So like a site that maybe hasn't historically been damaged. So you've got these 2 options for comparing to see how well we're doing at the kind of efforts that we're trying to do in terms of restoration. And so it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of how we interpret the outcomes. And so this is a paper that came out a few years ago, but I think the findings are still really consistent, where they went out, collected a bunch of data from a variety of different wetland ecosystem restoration projects, and then tried to measure outcomes, and then compared them to some really specific baseline. And so what I'm showing you here is part of their a figure where they're looking at different so they're measuring success based on different ecosystem services. So supporting services, regulating services, provisioning services, and cultural services. And for this particular one, the 0 line represents the degraded site. So they're comparing the restored sites compared to the degraded sites. And so positive values indicate that the restored sites are performing better than the degraded site. Negative values indicate that the restored site is underperforming compared to the degraded site. And we can see that across every single ecosystem service that they're measuring, the restored site is doing better than the degraded site, which is like great news, right? It means that we're doing something good in terms of our efforts to improve the quality and the function of these systems, which is great. But like I said, that's only half of the story. When you also then compare a restored site to a historically sort of healthy ecosystem that hasn't really been damaged all that much historically, the picture is really, really different. So in these cases, we tend to see that by and large, restored sites tend to underperform compared to these natural healthy systems, with the exception of some of these cultural services. And that's kind of tricky to dig into because here they're focusing specifically on recreation. You can really kind of build systems to really fit specifically what recreation activities you want to have done within them. But other cultural services are really harder to sort of manifest and make artificially. But by and large, what we're seeing here is that we're doing a good job of recovering services, but we're doing a bad job of recovering them back to what we think they should be in terms of full levels of health. And so the average, I'll also note, is by sort of roughly 33%. So restored wetlands tend to have reduced biodiversity and ecosystem processes by roughly 33% when compared to their healthy counterparts. And so part of what I'm interested in then is trying to figure out why we have that gap. So I think it's great we can pat ourselves on the back about how we're doing a great job of improving certain levels of function, but I also think that we should be asking the question about like, why aren't we able to do it well enough to really recover full levels of function and services across these ecosystems? And so part of what I think the reasoning for this is, so there's lots of potential explanations, right? The size of the wetland site, the location, the environmental context. There's a lot of different variables that sort of fall into the reason why we might not get the kind of recovery we're hoping for. But I actually think that if we go back to the drawing board, I think part of the problem is just like how we do restoration in the first place. So there's a lot of variety in terms of the approaches that are taken for a restoration effort, but most of them tend to include at least these 3 steps, where the first one is to remove the disturbance. So whatever was causing the problem in the first place, just like deal with that, because anything you do beyond that or without doing that is really kind of useless. Next is to then do something called rehabilitate the soil and improve the hydrology. And this just means to make sure that our soil quality is really what it should be, that we have proper nutrients, that the water is flowing through the system properly. So proper soil drainage and inundation is really important for these kinds of systems. So making sure that that is physically set up properly is an important step. And then the last step typically is really to just restore the vegetation. So just like plant a bunch of things, everything that you think should be across these sites. And these are the things that tend to be the primary steps taken when you think about restoration. And part of the reason for this is because of that sort of initial ecological paradigm where they said the physical parts are most important for these ecosystems. So we have to make sure the physical parts, and we're including vegetation as a physical part here because it's part of the habitat. So it's part of what is required for species to come back into these environments and live within them. And so if we fix the physical parts, everything else will kind of fix itself over time, which is kind of the sort of running assumption with how these kinds of efforts go. It fully disregards the fact that different species play different roles within ecosystems, and their presence can often help facilitate levels of function or processes or increases in biodiversity across the space. And so I think it could be important to take into consideration a lot of these more biological elements within the system to help improve some of our outcomes when we think about restoring these environments. And so to show you what I mean, I'll go back to, so what I like to do is like make really fake schematics to sort of theoretically show you what I think could go, or how these things could play out in real time. So if we're to start, for example, with an ecosystem that looks like this, and so the assumption here is that this environment has just been largely overgrazed. So whatever herbivore is present across these spaces has just like really chowed down on the vegetation here to an extent that has made it really difficult for anything else to grow back within these spaces. And in many cases, especially on the East Coast of North America, the reason that that happens is because there's not really a healthy predator population present across these environments to help control the population size of the herbivores that are there. And so I can imagine a situation where you're looking at a site that has sort of this relative breakdown, where we've got our soil across the bottom, our really unhappy vegetation that's not super great at growing across the space because of the levels of consumption. And then we've got just a really robust population of an herbivore that's really prevalent across this environment. And so again, on the East Coast, that's that purple marsh crab. And so if we're thinking about ways to help recover levels of function, levels of health across these spaces, you could make an argument that having a healthy predator population, and again, I apologize for using green crab, there's a reason for it, we can talk about it later. But if you include or sort of reinforce the healthy, robust predator population across these spaces, over time, you can see a reduction in prey population size that can then facilitate the growth of vegetation. And then you've got yourself a healthier, happier, functioning ecosystem. And there is actually a lot of evidence to suggest that this is a real thing that has happened, especially along the East Coast, where blue crab, which is a native predator across those spaces, has had reduced population size because they're just really important economically and recreationally. And the green crab, though invasive, has sort of come in and supplanted the blue crab as sort of a functional predator across those spaces. And where that has happened, we've seen regrowth of vegetation and levels of function across those environments. And so that is a sort of unnatural sort of experiment that happened all on its own, but it sort of indicates that there are these elements that are really important to consider in terms of levels of function that we can experience or see within these environments. Thinking about my timing, I'll keep going. So what I wanted to do then to try to understand how this could play out is I did the exact same experiment that I told you about before, but just ran it over a longer period of time. Often restoration outcomes don't really manifest within the first year. It usually takes at least 5 or more years for you to really see recovery of certain services. So I ran this experiment over a 3-year period. I couldn't do 5, it's like a PhD. But I did it for as long as I could and tried to see like what happened over that longer time period. Are we seeing different levels of function shifting or recovering in the presence or absence of these particular species across the landscape? So the breakdown is exactly the same as it was before. So our controls, predator excluded and predator included. And so the data that I'm going to show you now are really thinking about how some of these variables shifted in the presence or absence of these species in ways that might implicate their importance for restoration potential. So shown here is, we're just looking at one variable in particular right now. So this is just nitrogen absorption. So just kind of a proxy for how well is nitrogen being taken up by vegetation across these environments. Again, across the bottom are those same treatments, so the control, the no predator, and the predator. And what matters here really is the trend more than anything. So when looking at the control, so this is the baseline conditions at these sites. The assumption here also is that there is a healthy predator population across these ecosystems. So I'm doing this experiment not in a site that I think is damaged, but in a site that I think is representative ecologically of things that are really important to be aware of. And so this is the level of function that we saw observed at the control with no manipulation. So predators are still present across these particular plots. When we have the treatment where the predator was removed, we saw a pretty significant reduction in the level of function at this particular variable. And so that is like notable on its own. And then again, indication that biological features are important across these landscapes. And then when we add the predator back to the system, so this doesn't look super close to you all, but for me, it was like, oh, I'm so glad I see this. We see that the level of function is now sort of trying to increase back to what it was when the predator was present initially. So in these control conditions. So statistically speaking, these two are the same, even though I know looking at it, they don't look the same. But this is really kind of a fun indicator that removing a species does a thing, putting it back kind of fixes the thing that you broke when you took it out in the first place. And so these kinds of data are really exciting. And I think that indicate that if you have a longer period of time, you might even see a larger level of recovery of that particular feature that you're looking at. And so the same thing can be shown here. So now we're looking at biomass, and I'm showing this as the time series data over 2 years, because I want you to note that even though we're seeing this particular trend at one point in time, so we've got level of biomass here in control conditions, we see an increase when we took the predator away, we see it go back down when we put the predator back. We don't see that same trend the next year. And so this is again indication that there's still context dependency that's not just based on site, but also temporal. So there are a lot of other layers that have to be taken into account when thinking about doing this kind of work. And it also suggests that you can't just do this work at one point in time, right? So if you do one study one summer, you have great results and you like think that it speaks to the whole narrative of how that space works. If you do this over different periods of time, you'll start to see that these trends are going to shift over time, and there are lots of reasons for that. So I think this is just more evidence to suggest that there's a lot of complexity here that we have to be able to take into account when thinking about how we want to apply this in the real world. But for me, I think big picture, some of the bigger takeaways are really in terms of how we think about managing these ecosystems from an ecological perspective. And so historically, we have focused on these physical parts as being what's most important for helping the recovery of certain functions and features. But I think that we should also be thinking about the role that different biological species might also play in helping with the recovery of different features and functions across these environments. And there, again, is already evidence out there to suggest that this is a good idea. So the example that I gave on the East Coast with the crabs is one. I know Yellowstone is a little bit complicated, but it also is another example of restoring a certain functional role within that environment can lead to cascading effects that tend to be a net positive for the way that the system functions overall. And so I think that this is something that we should be taking into account more when considering how to restore coastal systems in particular. With that in mind, I will say that there are a lot of caveats and a lot of considerations. I feel like this whole talk has been me saying like one thing and then being like, there's more to consider. It's not that easy. And that's just the reality. So there's a lot of differences, at least across the sites that I have worked in. There are lots of reasons why we might have seen different levels of function and different outcomes depending on those experiments. Some of those could just be simply because the ecological communities were not exactly the same across each site. So as much as I tried to keep them consistent, there were slight differences in who was present and who was absent across these environments. Different species also respond differently to predators. And so depending on where you are and what species you have present across those spaces, their anti-predatory behaviors are going to be slightly different. And those different reactions can also manifest as different impacts on the ecosystem itself. And then again, as I mentioned, there's temporal issues that you have to take into account, and then also local and regional context. So what is the historical land use history? What are the surrounding landscapes that might be influencing the ecosystem that you're working in? So there's a lot to take into account, but I think that it's worth doing and something that I'm hoping to continue moving forward. So I have like a ton more slides because I was like, here's more things I want to share with you, but I don't have time for that. So what I will do is just kind of share with you what I'm hoping to do moving forward. And so I'm really interested in trying to dig into these caveats. So what is causing the context dependency? So it's not enough to like do your research, write your paper and end it with like, but it depends. We have to like do more research and figure out what comes next. I'm actually really, really interested in doing that part. So trying to figure out what are the various contexts that influence these relationships between the different species and what might drive whether or not there's a larger top-down forcing happening across the site or a bottom-up forcing happening across the site. And I've done a little bit of this already, and so I won't get into it here, but across the 3 sites, I collected all of the data, put it all into one, effectively one analysis for each site and tried to figure out which of the variables at each site was really driving the relationships and really driving the outcomes. And you can't read this, which is actually probably better that you can't. But these are the 3 different sites. And for each one, you can just see that there are different things that are highlighted across these figures. I don't know where that is. But all of this is really to indicate that at each of these locations, different features were the ones that were really driving the relationships and driving the outcomes of these experiments. And so it wasn't as simple as like just the experiment that I set up, but also the different variables within the experiment had feedbacks that were influencing each other. And those were being driven in very unique and different ways across these environments. And so very lastly, what I'm hoping to do now in my work here is to really try to get at that context dependency. And so I love doing the same thing over and over and over again, just in like different places. And so my goal is to set up really similar experiments across different kinds of coastal systems, hopefully simultaneously, and then see what happens in terms of the outcomes and try to measure as many different environmental features across each of these sites to try to account for different levels of variation or confounding variables that might influence some of these outcomes. But I'm really interested in just going to as many places as possible or paying other people to do so, to do this kind of work, to really help us do a better job of predicting outcomes so that we can then take that information and then apply it to what we're actually trying to do in the real world, which is improve the health of these ecosystems. And so I think I'll mostly wrap up with that. I'll just let you know that I'm also doing this work in mangroves. So I started doing some field work in Florida, which is a terrifying place, but I felt like it was important to try to get out there and do some of this work. So I've been setting up these experiments within these ecosystems. There's a lot of different species that are present out there. These are some of the plots that I set up, blah, blah, blah. there's a lot of questions that I have remaining from that work because it's really difficult, as you can picture, how do you set up a cage in an ecosystem that looks like that? And so I've been really kind of struggling with trying to figure out how to do it. And everyone's like, no one's ever done it. And I was like, we've got to do it. So I'm just spending all my time trying to figure out how to set up work within these environments to try to answer some of these questions that are so really important, but hard to answer because we can't set up this work in ways that are really straightforward. And yeah, anyway, so that's all my stuff. I'm sorry I threw it all at you. I got really excited towards the middle. And yeah, but I'm excited about this work. I'm excited about the ways in which I think it translates across different spaces. And I'm also equally excited about the human aspect of it, which I didn't have time to get into today, but really thinking about the ways that people who build their lives around ecosystems and natural spaces, I think should be really fully brought into this work and should lead this work. And so I'm trying to do my best to sort of be humble and learn from those spaces and those people and incorporate that into the way that I do this work. And so with that, I'll stop talking. I think we've got time for questions, and then otherwise happy to chat with everyone at the pizza afterwards. So the question is about thinking about the ways in which, so part of my framing is thinking about reintroducing different species that might have predatory roles. And some can make the argument that humans also have this really large impact along the spaces. And so we need to be taken into account in how we do this work. I 100% agree. So historically, and even in practice today, I think we all know that the way that we practice conservation, the way that we practice restoration has really been to the exclusion of people. Right. And I think that there is an increasing urgency to recognize that people have always impacted landscapes, right? Even healthy landscapes have in some way been modified and impacted by human presence. And a lot of the examples of that exist that are done in harmony with nature and are sustainable are pretty present across different indigenous First Nations, histories of communities that have long, long legacies with their interaction with the land. And so I think that there's clearly pushback, especially if you think about how we practice conservation and restoration today from a large scale government NGO perspective. They tend to swoop in with money and with science and say this is how it should be done. But I think there's increasing evidence to note, and that indicates that community-led efforts are far more successful and far more sustainable. I don't have it here. I gave a talk yesterday where we can break down conservation outcomes. And if you're thinking about conservation outcomes in terms of biodiversity impacts and also human health and well-being, you can either have positive for both, negative for both, or a trade-off between the two. Those that tend to be positive for both are those that are community-led, and those that tend to be largely negative for both tend to be led by outside organizations. And so I think that this is an argument for including people more in the process in a way that is equitable. There are many examples of how you can use the land without depleting the land. And so I think that we just have to be louder about making our argument for being able to do that in all of the work that we do. All of this is terrible. So yeah, so in terms of the question, so the question for this slide is when you're thinking about the role that predators play, so you've got predator, herbivore, vegetation. The assumption normally is that if you have a predator present, it means that the herbivores will be lower, which means that the vegetation will be higher. We're seeing the opposite here in my graphs, which is what the question was why? So clearly I didn't go out to measure exactly why I think this happened. There are two running what's the word I'm looking for? I have guesses for why I think this is the case. One, there's a lot of compensatory growth that happens across these ecosystems. So when you have herbivores that are consuming vegetation, sometimes plants are we just need to grow more. And so you can see an increase in growth in the presence of herbivory as the plant is sort of responding to that. So that is one potential. The other one that I think is actually maybe a little bit stronger here and really interesting is that, which I couldn't show you in today's talk, the herbivore and the detritivore are both burrowing crabs. Their behavior of burrowing tends to make the soil more productive and healthy. It makes more nutrients available for plant growth. So there's an argument to be made here that the burrowing behavior facilitated increasing soil quality, which facilitated better growth of vegetation that outweighed the consumption that was happening by the herbivory. But I have no proof of this. But these are just the things that are sort of running around in terms of why I think that could have happened in these cases. Yeah, I don't pretend to understand everything in that Costanza paper. It's very economics math heavy, which is not my strong suit. But I think it was a great place to start. And I think it was a really good paper that really made people think more concretely about value of ecosystems. And I think that I have mixed feelings about doing things like that, but I think in terms of selling it to the sort of general population, I think there is relevance in making that argument. So I appreciate it and highly recommend everyone take a look at it just to I don't know, maybe feel less smart about math the way that it made me feel. there's kind of lots of answers to that. So the question here is really thinking about the negative impact that the European green crab can have, because I mentioned it a couple different times. And so, as the name suggests, European green crab is native to Europe. It was introduced along the east coast of the US or North America in like the 1800s. So it's like been here for quite a while. Some can make an argument, or some have made the argument, that it's like largely naturalized across that space because it has been here for so long. There are always going to be like local efforts to help minimize the impact that they have, but I think by and large, their populations are so robust along the East Coast that that's really not really something you can do super well. They do have lots of negative impacts, especially for like the shellfish industry and other kinds of things that are really economically important. They're really good at going out and like demolishing juveniles of these species before they become large enough to be really economically viable. So yes, many negative impacts. Most of them tend to be largely economic. There are some ecological negative impacts, but they don't seem to be quite as robust as some of the ones that humans tend to pay more attention to. And so yeah, so there's a lot of negative impacts. I feel mixed in general. So my sort of opinion about it is that there is no way, I think, at this point to have an ecosystem be exactly what it used to be. I think that novel interactions and novel species presence will always be what happens. It's really starting to think about what are the ways that we can understand how that novel presence shapes the way that the system works and how might it have impacts moving into the future. I think there is a large argument to be made about reducing the presence of this species on this coast, right? So it's still kind of in its infancy of its invasion, especially within British Columbia. So I think it's like not quite here yet. Like I think it's in Washington State and it's like knocking at the door of BC. And there are a lot of communities that are doing a lot of work to prevent it from moving upward into this landscape. And there are a lot of reasons for wanting to mitigate that impact. And so I think that your efforts are better served doing that here than they would be doing that on the East Coast. But yeah, I tend to try to understand that these are species that, as much as we like to categorize them as being invasive, and I have weird feelings about the terminology that we use, they also do sometimes play positive roles. And I think that that gets lost in the conversation because it's a very polarizing topic. I think the example that I showed here is that this is a largely sort of negatively perceived species that has helped recover the health of really important coastal spaces in Massachusetts. And so I think we're starting to recognize that there's a duality that needs to be reconciled when we think about the role that these species play. So yeah. Yes. Yeah, I'm super new to the West Coast. So all of the stuff that I've done has been East Coast based. And I have work that I'm starting up in American Samoa, so in the Pacific Islands, and I'm starting a little bit of work in Southeast Asia, but I don't know anything about the West Coast. And so I've just been like meeting with everyone to be like, who do you know? How can I help? And what are the ways that I can get engaged? So 100% the answer is yes. Yeah.